Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. When people later tried to describe Lily Harper, they almost always mentioned her smile first. It was the kind of smile that showed up easily and stayed a moment longer than expected, wide and unguarded, the sort that made adults lean down just a little closer. Lily was born on October 11, 2009, in a quiet Midwestern city called Riverbend, Missouri. Her parents, Daniel Harper and Melissa Reed, were young when she arrived, still learning how to be adults while raising a child who seemed to trust the world without hesitation. For the first year of Lily's life, things were unstable but not unusual. Daniel and Melissa argued, reconciled, argued again. By the end of 2010, they separated for good. They agreed to share custody, at least in theory. In practice, money and housing quickly complicated everything. Melissa struggled after leaving the shared apartment. She bounced between friends' couches and short-term rentals, taking whatever work she could find. Daniel, meanwhile, stayed put. He had a steady job, a familiar neighborhood, and a routine that looked dependable on paper. When Melissa admitted she needed time to get back on her feet, Daniel agreed to take Lily full-time. In February of 2011, a family court granted him temporary primary custody. At first, it seemed like the right decision. Not long after, Daniel began dating a woman named Rachel Moore. Rachel had 2 children from a previous relationship and a reputation for being blunt, easily irritated, and deeply resentful of anything that disrupted her sense of control. Friends later said Rachel never hid the fact that Lily felt like an inconvenience to her. By spring, Lily was enrolled in a local daycare center just a few blocks from Daniel's home. During her first week, she adjusted well. She played alongside other toddlers, she ate her meals, she napped when the lights dimmed and the room quieted. Nothing about her behavior raised alarms. Then the bruises started appearing. At first, they were small, a mark on her arm, a faint discoloration on her cheek. Daniel and Rachel had explanations ready. Lily was clumsy. She bumped into furniture. She fell while learning to walk faster. The daycare staff noted the injuries but accepted the explanations, at least initially. By the second week, the marks became harder to dismiss. New bruises appeared in places toddlers rarely injure accidentally. Some were darker, others were partially hidden beneath long sleeves or carefully blended makeup that did not quite match Lily's skin tone. One staff member overheard Rachel refer to Lily as a problem child while dropping her off, her voice sharp, impatient. Lily began to change. She stopped running to the door in the mornings. She clung to caregivers longer. During nap time, she sometimes woke screaming, inconsolable, her small body shaking as if startled from something she could not explain. Her appetite faded. Her cheeks lost their fullness. When staff raised concerns again, Daniel brushed them off. "She doesn't eat much at home either," he said once. "She's just being difficult." By mid-March, Lily struggled to walk steadily. One caregiver noticed her favoring one leg, wincing slightly when she stood. That same day, a report was made to Child Protective Services. An investigator visited the home. Daniel and Rachel presented themselves calmly. Their house was clean, their answers were practiced. Lily, shy and quiet, stayed close to Daniel, her eyes fixed on the floor. The investigator noted the concerns, but found no immediate cause to remove her from the home. The case was closed as inconclusive. At daycare, the staff felt uneasy. Lily arrived one morning with a fever and did not return for several days. When she came back, she seemed exhausted, her movements slower, her gaze unfocused. By then, the bruises were no longer subtle. On March 24, 2011, Rachel dialed 911. She told the dispatcher that Lily was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find the toddler barely breathing. Her head was visibly swollen. Her body showed extensive signs of injury that no fall or accident could explain away. She was rushed to the nearest children's hospital, where a team of doctors immediately recognized the severity of her condition. Scans revealed massive brain swelling and internal injuries consistent with repeated trauma. The attending radiologist later testified that the force required to cause such damage was extreme and recent. Emergency surgery followed. Doctors removed a portion of Lily's skull to relieve the pressure, hoping to save her life. The swelling did not stop. A drain was placed to remove fluid. Still, her condition worsened. She was placed into a medically induced coma. Hospital staff observed Daniel during his visits. He stood at the bedside, silent, his expression flat. A nurse later recalled him whispering, "I'm sorry," before turning away without tears. Lily never woke. On March 31, 2011, just days after her second birthday, she was pronounced dead after being removed from life support. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide, citing multiple injuries inflicted over time. Investigators turned their attention fully to Daniel and Rachel. Rachel claimed Lily had gone down for a nap and later began convulsing without warning. Daniel insisted he never harmed his daughter, admitting only that he sometimes became frustrated. He said Lily had been sick and irritable, nothing more. But evidence from the home told a different story. Investigators found tissues stained with Lily's blood and traces of cosmetic products used to conceal bruising. Phone records showed messages between Daniel and Rachel discussing Lily as a burden, a source of constant stress. Weeks later, Daniel contacted police again. This time, his story changed. He admitted he had noticed Lily's bruises for weeks. He acknowledged he had been rough with her at times, claiming he lost patience. He insisted he never intended to hurt her. The investigation widened. At Lily's visitation, held at a small funeral home in Riverbend, mourners struggled to reconcile the smiling photos on display with the details emerging in court documents. Melissa stood apart from Daniel and Rachel, grief etched into her face. She later testified that she had noticed bruises during her visits, that Lily seemed withdrawn and medicated. She said she had raised concerns but trusted Daniel when he reassured her. Trust, it turned out, had been misplaced. Charges were filed with both Daniel Harper and Rachel Moore. What followed would stretch on for years, revealing not only the violence Lily endured, but the failures of systems meant to protect her. And Lily's story wasn't the only one. Across the country, another child would soon emerge as part of a haunting pattern. Different names, different places, the same warnings ignored. But that story begins elsewhere.
By the time people outside the apartment began to sense that something was wrong, the damage had already been unfolding for weeks. In early spring, little Lena Hartwell was enrolled at a neighborhood daycare on the west side of Riverbend, Missouri, a modest city that prided itself on being quiet and family-centered. At first, the caregivers described Lena as shy but gentle. She clung to stuffed toys, watched other children carefully before joining in, and smiled easily when spoken to softly. Nothing about her behavior suggested distress. That changed quickly. Within days, staff noticed bruises on Lena's arms and legs. At first, they assumed accidents. Toddlers fall. They bump into furniture. But what unsettled them was not just the marks themselves, but the explanations that followed. Each time a caregiver asked, the answers shifted. Her father, Evan Hartwell, would shrug and say she was clumsy. His girlfriend, Marissa Cole, offered different versions depending on the day. Lena had fallen off a couch, a toy shelf tipped over. She had hit herself during a tantrum. None of the stories quite matched the injuries, but none were dramatic enough on their own to trigger immediate action. What the staff could not ignore, however, was how Lena was changing. She stopped playing. She ate less. She flinched when adults raised their voices. During nap time, she often woke crying, confused and trembling, clutching the blanket she had brought from home. One worker later recalled that Lena's eyes always searched the room as if she was looking for an exit, even in sleep. By mid-March, the daycare documented their concerns. A report was filed with Child Protective Services after a caregiver noticed Lena struggling to walk properly one morning. When Evan was informed, he appeared irritated rather than concerned. He insisted Lena was tired and blamed a recent cold. Despite the report, no immediate removal occurred. At a local urgent care clinic, Lena was brought in for what Evan described as an eye infection and poor appetite. A nurse practitioner noted a visible bruise on Lena's forehead, larger than expected for a routine fall. Evan explained that she had hit a coffee table while toddling through the living room. The explanation was accepted. The visit ended with antibiotic drops and a suggestion to monitor her eating. No one connected the dots yet. Behind closed doors, the tension inside the apartment was growing. Evan had been granted temporary custody months earlier when Lena's mother, Rachel Moore, lost stable housing. The arrangement was meant to be short-term, a bridge until Rachel could get back on her feet. She called often, she asked to visit. Sometimes Evan agreed, sometimes he claimed it was inconvenient. Marissa resented those calls. She had 2 children of her own and saw Lena as an interruption. She complained to friends that the toddler cried too much, needed too much attention, and made their home chaotic. Text messages later recovered by police showed her frustration clearly, though at the time no one else saw them. By the 3rd week of March, Lena arrived at daycare with makeup faintly visible on her skin. It was subtle, but one staff member noticed discoloration that did not look natural. When asked, Marissa laughed it off, saying she had accidentally gotten foundation on the child while getting ready for work. The staff felt uneasy. Still, Lena went home each evening. On a Friday afternoon, Lena developed a fever. Evan picked her up early. She did not return the following week. Instead, on a quiet Sunday evening, emergency services were called to the apartment. Marissa told the dispatcher that Lena would not wake up. Paramedics arrived to find a child barely responsive. They immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation and rushed Lena to Riverbend Children's Hospital. Doctors worked quickly, but the signs were unmistakable. Lena had suffered severe injuries that did not occur all at once. A pediatric radiologist later testified that the damage showed both older and more recent trauma. The timing suggested repeated harm over days and weeks, not a single accident. The force involved was significant, far beyond what would be expected from ordinary childhood falls. Lena was taken into surgery in an attempt to relieve swelling. Her condition did not improve. Within days, she was placed on life support. Hospital staff observed Evan and Marissa closely during their visits. Marissa rarely approached the bedside. Evan stood silently, hands in pockets, avoiding eye contact. One nurse recalled him whispering, "I'm sorry," once, though it was unclear to whom he was speaking. Lena passed away a week later. The autopsy confirmed what doctors already suspected. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide, citing repeated injuries occurring at different times. Now the questions turned urgent. Who had hurt her, and why had no one stopped it? Police interviews began immediately. Marissa told investigators that Lena had been fussy all day. She said she bathed her, put her to bed, and later returned to find her unresponsive. She denied ever harming the child and suggested that Lena may have had a seizure. Evan's story shifted. At first, he claimed he had not noticed the bruises. Later, he admitted seeing them, but insisted he believed Marissa's explanations. Eventually, he acknowledged that he had grown frustrated at times, that parenting alone had overwhelmed him, that he sometimes needed to step away to calm down. He stopped short of admitting violence. Investigators, however, were not convinced. Evidence from the apartment told a different story. Makeup consistent with what had been used to cover Lena's skin was found on tissues bearing her DNA. This suggested an attempt to conceal injuries rather than explain them. Rachel, Lena's mother, was informed of her daughter's death while at work. She collapsed. In court months later, she testified that during visits, she had noticed bruises and changes in Lena's behavior. She said she felt something was wrong, but trusted that authorities would intervene after the daycare report. They had not. As the case moved forward, the public began asking difficult questions. Why had earlier reports not led to intervention? Why were warning signs dismissed? Why did no system act decisively when a child was clearly deteriorating? The answers were uncomfortable. And as investigators dug deeper, investigators realized Lena's story was not an isolated failure. Several years earlier, in a different state, another child had slipped through the same cracks. That case would soon become impossible to ignore.
As the case surrounding Lena Hartwell moved toward trial, public attention intensified. What had once been a quiet family tragedy became a mirror held up to institutions that were meant to protect the most vulnerable. Prosecutors were no longer focused solely on how Lena died, but on how many opportunities there had been to prevent it. Evan Hartwell and Marissa Cole were both charged with serious felony offenses related to child endangerment and unlawful conduct resulting in death. Initially, prosecutors pursued the highest charges available under Missouri law, arguing that the prolonged nature of the harm demonstrated a clear disregard for human life. Defense attorneys, however, pushed back hard. They framed the case as one built on circumstantial evidence and emotional reaction rather than direct proof. Each defendant blamed the other. Evan's lawyers argued that he was a struggling single parent who trusted his partner and failed to recognize the signs. Marissa's defense portrayed her as overwhelmed but not violent and suggested that Evan's temper was the real danger. The courtroom became a place of quiet tension. Medical experts testified first. Pediatric specialists explained how injuries occurring at different stages of healing indicated repeated trauma. Radiologists described patterns that could not be attributed to normal childhood accidents. Their testimony was careful, clinical, and devastating in its clarity. Daycare workers followed. One by one, they described the bruises, the behavioral changes, the reports filed, and the frustration they felt when nothing changed. Their voices cracked as they spoke about the helplessness of watching a child deteriorate while being required to release her back into the same environment every evening. Rachel Moore, Lena's mother, testified last for the prosecution. She spoke about the guilt that had consumed her since her daughter's death, about trusting the system, about believing that shared custody, even temporary, was better than instability. She described the moment she realized that Lena's fear was not shyness, but survival instinct. Her testimony left the courtroom silent. After weeks of proceedings, the jury delivered split outcomes. Evan Hartwell was found guilty of child endangerment resulting in death. He received a lengthy prison sentence, though less than prosecutors had sought. The judge cited negligence, failure to protect, and inconsistent statements as aggravating factors. Marissa Cole's trial ended differently. Text messages recovered from her phone became central to the case. In them, she complained about Lena using language that shocked the jury. In one exchange, she suggested she had gone too far during a moment of anger. While the defense argued exaggeration, the jury was unconvinced. Marissa was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to the maximum term allowed by law with no eligibility for early release. For many observers, the sentences felt uneven. Public reaction was swift. Editorials questioned how Evan could receive a lesser punishment despite being Lena's legal guardian. Advocacy groups held vigils outside the courthouse calling for reform in how child welfare reports are handled. But the story did not end there. During the investigation, prosecutors uncovered records from an unrelated case years earlier, one that bore unsettling similarities. A young boy, Noah Bennett, had died under the care of relatives in another state after repeated reports of abuse were overlooked. In both Noah's case, neighbors had reported screams, medical visits had raised concerns, social workers had noted risks, yet custody placements were never reevaluated in time. 2 children, 2 systems, the same outcome. A state review panel was convened to examine both cases. Their findings were blunt. Agencies had failed to communicate effectively. Reports were treated as isolated incidents rather than cumulative warnings. Caseworkers were overburdened, undertrained, and pressured to prioritize family reunification over immediate safety. Background checks were incomplete. Follow-ups were delayed or never conducted. The panel concluded that Lena's death, like Noah's before her, was preventable. Policy changes followed. Mandatory response timelines were shortened. Repeat reports involving the same child were flagged automatically. Daycare providers were given expanded authority to escalate concerns directly to multidisciplinary teams. Caseworkers received additional training focused on recognizing patterns rather than isolated injuries. These changes came too late for Lena. Rachel Moore later established a foundation in her daughter's name dedicated to advocating for stronger child protection laws and supporting parents navigating custody transitions. She spoke publicly, not as a legal expert, but as a mother who had trusted systems that failed her child. "I don't want another parent to sit in a courtroom wondering why no one listened sooner," she said during one address. Evan Hartwell appealed his conviction years later, citing ineffective counsel. The appellate court granted a partial review, ultimately reducing his sentence after a plea agreement. He was released on probation after serving a fraction of his original term. The decision reignited public outrage. Marissa Cole remains incarcerated. For many, justice felt incomplete. Yet Lena's story continued to shape conversations around child safety. Her case was referenced in legislative hearings, training manuals, and academic studies examining institutional failure. Her name became shorthand for the cost of hesitation. Statistics tell a sobering story. Child fatalities linked to caregiver violence remain disproportionately high. Most victims are harmed by someone they know. Warning signs are often visible, documented, and explained away. Intervention comes late, if at all. Lena Hartwell was not invisible. She was seen, she was documented, she was reported, and still she was sent back. That truth remains the most uncomfortable part of this story. Justice is measured in convictions and sentences, but prevention is measured in moments when someone acts before a child is harmed beyond repair. In Lena's case, those moments passed quietly, buried in paperwork and assumptions. Her life, brief as it was, exposed the gap between responsibility and action. And in that exposure lies her legacy. Not just a victim, but a warning. A reminder that systems do not fail all at once. They fail slowly through missed chances, softened language, and the belief that someone else will intervene. Lena deserved better. So did every child whose voice was too small to be heard over excuses. Their stories demand more than remembrance. They demand change. The last confirmed sighting of Daniel Mercer was ordinary enough that no one remembered it clearly at first. A young man stood near a weathered trailhead sign just after sunrise, adjusting the straps on a faded blue backpack. He spoke briefly with another hiker about trail conditions, nodded, and stepped past the wooden post marking the start of the Granite Ridge Loop. No urgency. No distress, just a quiet decision to walk into the mountains alone. Daniel was 29 years old, experienced enough to know the basics, confident enough to underestimate the margin for error. He had completed longer hikes, steeper climbs, and harsher weather before. Friends described him as methodical, cautious, not reckless. He checked forecasts, he packed food, he told someone where he was going. That was why his disappearance would become so troubling. Granite Ridge National Preserve stretched across miles of dense forest, uneven elevation, and narrow ravines. It was popular but unforgiving. Trails twisted through tree cover that blocked GPS signals. Weather could shift without warning. Cell service faded within minutes of leaving the parking area. Daniel planned a solo day hike, nothing extreme, in and out by evening. He never came back. When Daniel failed to return home that night, his sister, Emily, tried not to panic. She told herself he was running late, maybe he stopped to take photos, maybe his phone battery died. By midnight, her reassurance had turned into dread. At 1:42 a.m., she called park authorities. The ranger on duty logged the report but classified it as a delayed hiker. Standard procedure required waiting until daylight to initiate a full search unless there was clear evidence of danger. Emily pushed back. Daniel never disappeared. He never ignored messages. He never stayed out overnight without telling someone. The ranger promised to note her concerns. By the time the first search team assembled the next morning, 12 hours had already passed. Search and rescue operations rely heavily on time. The first 24 hours are critical, especially in terrain like Granite Ridge. Footprints fade, clues erase, small mistakes compound quickly. That morning, fog clung low to the forest. Visibility was poor. Helicopters were grounded. Ground teams were limited to the main trails, moving cautiously to avoid injury. Daniel's car was still parked at the trailhead, exactly where he had left it. Inside, responders found nothing unusual. No note, no indication he planned to deviate from his route. His wallet was gone, his phone not recovered. Searchers split into teams, following established protocols. They checked trail junctions, creek crossings, and known hazard points. They called his name, listening for a response that never came. By the end of the first day, there were no confirmed signs of Daniel beyond the trailhead. On day 2, the search expanded. Volunteer teams arrived. Tracking dogs were brought in, though their effectiveness was compromised by heavy foot traffic from the previous day. Thermal imaging flights began once the fog lifted, scanning tree cover and rocky slopes. Nothing. As the days passed, questions began to surface. Why had the search been delayed overnight when Daniel had a clear pattern of reliability? Why was the initial search area so narrow? Why were certain off-trail ravines not searched until later, despite being known accident zones? Emily began documenting everything. Every call, every timeline inconsistency, every explanation that felt rehearsed rather than precise. By day 4, the official tone shifted. Park officials began using phrases like low probability of survival and voluntary absence. Media briefings suggested Daniel may have left the trail intentionally. That narrative spread quickly, despite no evidence to support it. Friends pushed back. Daniel had no reason to vanish. He had plans, a job he showed up to early, a family he spoke to daily. The suggestion that he simply walked away felt like a convenient conclusion rather than a reasoned one. On day 6, a volunteer searcher found something that reignited hope. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch near a dry creek bed, roughly a mile off the main trail. The color matched Daniel's outer layer. But instead of expanding the search immediately, officials paused. The fabric could not be conclusively identified. It was logged, photographed, and left in place while supervisors debated resource allocation. That decision would later become one of the most criticized moments of the entire operation.
When teams finally searched the surrounding area more thoroughly, heavy rain had already fallen. Any tracks or disturbances were gone. Public attention grew. Local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines framed it as a mystery, then as a cautionary tale. Online forums speculated wildly. Some suggested animal encounters, others pointed to falls or medical events. A few proposed foul play, citing past incidents in the preserve that had never been fully explained. Officials dismissed those ideas as unlikely. Still, inconsistencies piled up. One ranger claimed Daniel's phone last pinged near the northern ridge. Another report stated there were no pings after he entered the park. A volunteer later said a search dog alerted strongly near a ravine that was never fully explored due to terrain difficulty. Each contradiction chipped away at confidence. Emily requested official records. Some were delayed, others arrived partially redacted. She learned that staffing shortages had limited overnight patrols, that one search team had mistakenly logged an area as cleared when it had not been fully covered, that weather reports underestimated the severity of conditions Daniel likely faced. None of these errors alone explained Daniel's disappearance. Together, they painted a picture of fragmentation. By the end of the second week, the search was officially scaled back. Active operations were suspended, replaced by periodic checks and passive reporting. The language shifted from rescue to recovery, though no remains had been found. Emily refused to accept it. She organized independent search efforts, former military trackers, local climbers, people who knew the land beyond official maps. They found areas the original teams had missed. Steep drop-offs hidden by brush, narrow ledges invisible from above. They also found something else, a boot print partially preserved in mud near a rock face, inconsistent with search team footwear. It appeared to match Daniel's hiking boots. When Emily presented this to authorities, she was told it could not be verified. The print was photographed. No further action followed. As weeks turned into months, the story faded from headlines, but questions lingered. Why did search timelines change in official reports? Why were volunteer findings minimized? Why did officials resist expanding certain search zones despite multiple indicators? Daniel Mercer had not vanished into thin air. He had entered a system designed to save lives. And somewhere between protocol, delay, and assumption, that system failed him. What happened on Granite Ridge remains unresolved, and the deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the disappearance itself might not be the most disturbing part of the story. The failures that followed were. When official search operations slowed, the mountain did not become quiet. It only became less organized. By the third week after Daniel Mercer vanished, Granite Ridge felt different to those who returned. Volunteers still walked the trails, calling his name long after authorities stopped answering questions. Flyers curled on bulletin boards, ribbons tied to trees faded under sun and rain. The landscape showed no sign of the man it had swallowed, yet it carried the weight of unfinished business. Emily Mercer refused to let the case dissolve into silence. She filed formal requests for operational logs, radio transcripts, and decision timelines. What she received was incomplete. Some records contradicted public statements, others were missing entirely. In one instance, a search grid marked as cleared on an official map had never been assigned a team at all. That discovery marked a turning point. Up until then, Emily believed the search had simply been unlucky. Now she began to suspect it had been flawed from the start.
Independent experts she consulted explained how search and rescue failures rarely come from a single mistake. They come from layers, delays that shrink survivability windows, assumptions that steer resources away from critical zones, administrative pressure to conclude operations before uncomfortable questions arise. Granite Ridge had all three. One of the most troubling issues involved terrain prioritization. Daniel's intended route included a narrow spur trail that descended toward a series of ravines before reconnecting to the loop. It was not officially closed, but it was known to be dangerous, especially after rain. Several hikers over the years had been injured there, though none fatally. That spur trail was not searched until day 5. By then, storms had passed through twice. Search coordinators later stated the area was considered low probability because Daniel was believed to be an experienced hiker, unlikely to take unnecessary risks. That assumption was never backed by evidence. It was simply convenient. Another issue involved tracking dogs. 2 canine units independently alerted near the same drainage area on separate days. In both cases, handlers recommended expanding the search downhill toward a boulder field. Those recommendations were logged, then overridden due to concerns about rescuer safety and time constraints. No alternative plan was implemented. Emily learned this months later, buried in a supplemental report she almost missed. When she confronted park officials, they emphasized the dangers of the terrain and the responsibility to protect search personnel. That explanation, while valid on its surface, failed to address the core question. If the most likely location was too dangerous to search, why was the case being quietly closed? The narrative began to shift in subtle ways. Public statements increasingly framed Daniel as someone who may have chosen to leave the trail. Officials referenced other cases where hikers voluntarily disappeared without evidence. The implication was clear. Responsibility was being redirected away from the search itself. Friends and coworkers pushed back. Daniel had no history of impulsive behavior. He had left behind personal items, ongoing commitments, and future plans. There was no sign of preparation for disappearance, no financial activity, no contact. Despite this, the voluntary disappearance theory stuck. It was easier. Behind the scenes, morale among volunteer searchers deteriorated. Several later admitted they felt their findings were dismissed or downplayed. One former firefighter described being told not to chase ghosts after reporting disturbed soil near a steep embankment. Another volunteer claimed a radio call reporting a possible scent trail was never relayed up the chain of command. None of these allegations were officially confirmed, but taken together, they formed a pattern. As winter approached, conditions worsened. Snow covered higher elevations, trails closed, access became limited. The mountain reclaimed itself, sealing whatever secrets it held. Emily expanded her efforts beyond the park. She requested cell phone data directly from Daniel's provider. The results contradicted earlier statements. While there were no outgoing signals after he entered the preserve, there was a brief, weak ping hours after he was reported missing. It originated from a sector that overlapped with the unsearched ravine area. Authorities acknowledged the data, but questioned its reliability. No follow-up search was ordered. Media interest reignited briefly when an anonymous source leaked internal emails suggesting pressure from park administration to scale back operations before a major tourist event. The implication was damaging, though never proven. Officials denied wrongdoing. An internal review was announced, then quietly concluded with no disciplinary action. The review cited resource limitations and reasonable decision-making under uncertainty. For Emily, it felt like a closed door. Then came the witness. Nearly 8 months after Daniel disappeared, a local climber came forward. He claimed that on the day Daniel went missing, he had seen someone matching Daniel's description off-trail near the ravine system, appearing disoriented and struggling to navigate steep ground. He had assumed rangers were already aware. They were not. The climber's statement placed Daniel in the very area that search dogs had flagged and teams had avoided. It also suggested Daniel may have survived longer than initially assumed, moving through difficult terrain without assistance. Authorities interviewed the climber once. No additional search followed. At this point, Emily stopped waiting for official action. She hired a private investigator with experience in wilderness cases. Together, they reconstructed Daniel's likely path using maps, weather data, and witness accounts. The model consistently pointed to one conclusion. Daniel likely left the main trail intentionally, not to disappear, but to regain it. A wrong turn, a misjudgment, a slow cascade of errors. In that scenario, survival would have depended entirely on how quickly help arrived. It did not. As the one-year anniversary approached, a memorial hike was organized. Hundreds attended. They walked the trail Daniel had planned to finish. They left stones and notes at the trailhead. They listened as Emily spoke, not about loss, but about accountability. She did not accuse, she asked questions. Why were early warnings minimized? Why were volunteer findings sidelined? Why did safety concerns override the core mission of rescue without alternatives? Those questions echoed beyond Granite Ridge. Similar cases surfaced, other families, other hikers, different parks, same themes. Delayed responses, narrow assumptions, searches that ended not because answers were found, but because patience ran out. Daniel Mercer's case was no longer about a missing hiker. It was about a system that struggled to admit uncertainty. As winter turned to spring again, snowmelt revealed new ground. Independent teams planned another search, focusing on areas previously deemed too dangerous or unlikely. Emily joined them. She did not expect closure. She expected honesty. Somewhere on that mountain, answers still waited, and with them the uncomfortable truth that Daniel might not have been lost to nature alone, but to hesitation, misjudgment, and a failure to act when it mattered most. What those answers would reveal and who would be forced to face them remained uncertain, but the search, at least for the truth, was far from over. Spring returned to Granite Ridge without ceremony. Snow receded from the upper slopes, exposing rock faces and gullies that had been sealed for months. Meltwater carved fresh channels through the ravines. Trails reopened. Tourists returned. On the surface, the preserve appeared healed. For Emily Mercer, the change in season meant something else. It meant access. The independent search began quietly, no press releases, no official coordination, just a small group of experienced volunteers, a retired search and rescue coordinator, a wilderness medic, and Emily. They worked within legal boundaries, notifying park officials of their presence but requesting no assistance. They were not there to rescue anyone. They were there to confirm what had gone wrong. The focus was narrow, the ravine system below the spur trail, the same area dogs had alerted to, the same area witnesses had mentioned, the same area marked low probability and left largely untouched during the critical early days. Progress was slow. The terrain was unstable, layered with loose stone and overgrowth. Visibility was limited. Movement required ropes and constant communication. It was exactly the kind of place where a tired hiker could disappear without leaving obvious traces. On the third day, they found the first sign. It was not dramatic, not a discovery that screamed answers, just a scuffed section of earth beside a fallen tree with fragments of fabric caught on bark. sun-bleached, weathered, indistinct, but it did not belong there naturally. The fabric was sent for analysis. 2 days later, the result came back inconclusive, too degraded to confirm ownership, but the weave and color were consistent with the type of hiking pants Daniel had been wearing. The team continued. Lower in the ravine, they located a partial boot print embedded in dried mud near a seasonal stream bed. It was distorted by erosion, but the tread pattern was visible enough to photograph and compare. It matched. What disturbed Emily most was not the evidence itself. It was how visible it was, how close it sat to areas marked as searched on official maps, how it could have been found within the first 48 hours if resources had been deployed differently. The implication was impossible to ignore. Daniel had likely been there early, alive. The next discovery ended speculation. At the base of a narrow chute wedged between 2 slabs of stone lay a backpack. Time had stripped it of color. Straps were frayed, zippers rusted, but the contents were unmistakable. A map of Granite Ridge, a water bottle, a compact first aid kit, a notebook. Daniel's notebook. Emily recognized the handwriting immediately. The final entries were brief, fragmented, notes about losing the trail, about descending to find a clearer route, about the weather turning faster than expected. The last line was incomplete. The medic confirmed what the team already knew. Daniel had been injured. A fall was the most likely scenario. The chute showed signs of disturbance consistent with a slide, rocks displaced, vegetation torn. Below it, the ravine deepened into terrain nearly impossible to climb without equipment. The team descended further the following morning. They found Daniel Mercer less than 200 yards from where the official search grid had ended. Time had reduced him to what remained. The medic handled the confirmation quietly, respectfully. There were no dramatic reactions, just silence. Emily knelt beside him and stayed there longer than anyone expected. What she felt was not relief, it was anger. The recovery process was swift and procedural. Authorities took over once remains were located, statements were issued, condolences followed. The narrative shifted overnight from missing person to tragic accident. But Emily was no longer listening to narratives. She was reading timelines. The medical examiner determined Daniel had survived for at least 2 days after his fall. Dehydration and exposure were contributing factors. His injuries, while serious, were not immediately fatal. That finding changed everything. Daniel had not vanished. He had waited. The question that followed was unavoidable. Why had help not reached him? The official response acknowledged regrettable limitations in the initial search. A revised internal report cited underestimated terrain risk, communication gaps, and a failure to escalate canine alerts appropriately. No individuals were named. No policies were formally changed. For Emily, that was not enough. She released the reconstructed timeline publicly, not as an accusation, but as documentation. She showed where decisions diverted resources away from high probability zones. She highlighted delays between canine alerts and follow-up searches. She included expert analysis demonstrating that an expanded early search of the ravine would have placed teams within shouting distance of Daniel while he was still alive. The response was immediate. Families from other cases reached out. Journalists reopened files. Legislators requested briefings. A pattern emerged that went far beyond Granite Ridge. Search and rescue failures were rarely malicious, they were systemic. Undated probability models, over-reliance on assumptions about victim behavior, administrative pressure to balance rescue efforts with budget and reputation, an unspoken fear of committing too many resources to cases that might end without resolution. Daniel's case became a reference point, not because it was unique, but because it was documented. A year later, Granite Ridge implemented new protocols. Early deployment thresholds were lowered. Canine alerts were given mandatory follow-up searches. Independent oversight was introduced for prolonged missing hiker cases. None of those changes brought Daniel back. Emily knew that, but she also knew something else. Silence nearly erased him. On the second anniversary of his disappearance, Emily returned to the trailhead alone. She walked the first mile of the path Daniel had planned to hike. She stopped where the spur trail diverged, now clearly marked with new signage. She did not blame the mountain. Granite Ridge did what mountains do. It tested judgment, it punished mistakes, it remained indifferent. People, however, had choices. Daniel's story ended not with mystery, but with clarity that arrived too late. The unanswered questions were no longer about where he went, but about how many others had followed similar paths and never been found because the search ended before the truth surfaced. In the end, the mountain didn't keep Daniel. Time did, and the cost of hesitation. The lesson carved at Granite Ridge was not about danger or adventure. It was about responsibility, about acting decisively when minutes matter, about listening when evidence speaks quietly instead of loudly. Emily left a simple marker near the spur trail, not a memorial, not a warning, just a reminder. Someone was here. Someone waited. And someone should have been looking sooner.